Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who would like the world to believe that he's a free speech absolutist, is now in the line of fire for allegedly curbing free speech. And the criticism has come from none other than tech mogul Elon Musk. This comes as the Canadian government takes steps to regulate online streaming services, prompting Musk to accuse Trudeau of crushing free speech, in his words. In the wake of a recent decision by the Canadian government requiring online streaming services to formally register for regulatory controls, journalist and author Glenn Greenwald took to social media to express his concerns. He described Canada's move as one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes. He wrote, the Canadian government, armed with one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes, announces that all online streaming services that offer podcasts must formally register with the government to permit regulatory controls. Musk responded to this tweet saying Trudeau is trying to crush free speech in Canada. Shameful. This move has intensified a growing debate over balance between government regulation and individual freedoms. Musk's comment adds fuel to the fire, as he's of course known for his outspoken views. And it's important to note that this isn't the first time that the Trudeau government has faced allegations of curtailing free speech. In February 2022, Prime Minister Trudeau invoked emergency powers for the first time in the country's history during the trucker protests against vaccine mandates. These measures were seen by some as a significant expansion of government authorities, sparking concerns over civil liberties in that country. Now, this latest incident comes against the backdrop of Trudeau's strained ties with India. Trudeau recently accused India of orchestrating the killing of Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. India swiftly rejected these claims as absurd and motivated and demanded evidence that Trudeau support his assertions. Remember, India has repeatedly accused Canada of harboring pro-Khalistani terrorists and extremists. But guess what Justin Trudeau has said every time India has taken up this matter with his government? Well, it is freedom of speech. All right, Shri, let me come to you. Now, even though this is frankly an ongoing debate in multiple countries around the world, including here in India, when it comes to matters of government regulation or controls versus free speech, but since this is Mr. Justin Trudeau that we're talking about, the great upholder of free speech, at least when it comes to Khalistanis, now he is being accused of quote-unquote crushing free speech in his country by none other than Elon Musk. How would you look at this controversy?
So, Neha, the first thing is the Online Streaming Act, which has been just passed. Basically, it requires podcast companies making more than $10 million in annual revenue to register. So, a lot of the smaller podcast operators who make less than $10 million a year, and 99.99999% of podcast companies don't make more than $10 million a year. So which is why Mr. Musk is also peeved, because Twitter is obviously a company which makes more than $10 million a year. So he would come under this regulation. But that said, there's absolutely no business for any government to get into what media should say or do in terms of the content. So this is being done under the guise of inclusion, of benefiting Canada, benefiting the diverse communities. So basically, the Canadian government has taken on the role of someone who will, in some sense, guide the content that podcast companies should be putting out so that the communities benefit. Now, that's a very superfluous kind of a reason because it doesn't really hold water. Because I think journalists and independent journalists, responsible journalists know what they're doing, and the free market in terms of the content consumption, I think is strong enough, it's robust enough for people to reject something that's not good enough. So I don't think there's any need for the government to get in and say, okay, your content must be shared this way because we think this is what will benefit the Canadian people. So that is absolutely none of the government's business, and that applies to Canada as well in this case. The other thing to know is that despite being a free country, Neha, Canada regulates its media quite a lot. For example, if you're first of all, if you're a broadcaster or you are a media company, you cannot have properties that have more than 45% of the Canadian viewership. So if you're catering to more than 45% of the Canadian market, people who are there, then you have to divest some assets. The other restriction is if you're operating in a particular market or a region, you cannot own three things, which is you can't have television, you can't have print and radio together. So you can only have two of these. You can either have radio and television or radio and print. You can't have all three. So despite being a free market, Canada does have a history of basically regulating its media and ownership. There are a lot of restrictions. It's not like the US, for example, where pretty much you're free to own whatever you want to do, and the market forces decide. So this does not show Canada in a great light. I mean, this attempt to uh, basically control or censor podcasts, because ultimately most of the podcasts, the ones which people consume, are smaller podcasts, and people should have the freedom to express their opinions, especially if the prime minister keeps saying that this is all about free speech. We guarantee freedom to our citizens, and if they're allowing all kinds of violence to take place under the name of free speech, then this is actually, it makes no sense at all, Neha.
Exactly. So, Shri, it wouldn't be incorrect to say, while of course you're right in pointing out that this is, Canada that has had such policies over a long time, but Justin Trudeau in particular seems to define freedom of expression very selectively based entirely on his convenience.
It does look so, Neha, and that is unfortunate. I think maybe the Canadian people will think, or probably they already think differently from the Prime Minister, and maybe we'll get to see, their point of view when the elections come around in 2025.
I really wonder what the Indian government would have to say about Elon Musk accusing Justin Trudeau of crushing freedom of speech. I mean, here's a man who has let, all kinds of violence happen right under his nose, all in the name of free speech. We are, of course, referring to the Khalistani issue.